I'm Franklin. You thought the most dangerous things in LA were the mobs or the crooked cops. The Pacific Ocean isn't like the Atlantic. It doesn't roar with the industrial rage of New York. It hums with a deceptive, hypnotic serenity. In Los Angeles, the ocean is the ultimate rug, the one the city lifts up every night to sweep its sins under. By morning, the tide has bleached the evidence, leaving nothing but sand and the smell of ozone. But even the Pacific has a stomach, and sometimes it vomits back the things it was told to swallow. Nick St. Clair stood at the edge of the Santa Monica Pier, lean and still as a heron. The year was 1952, and the neon sign of the Louvre Hippodrome flickered behind him, casting a garish, electric pink glow over the dark swells of the water. Nick didn't look at the lights. He looked at the froth. He was a fixer for the major studios, a man who turned scandals into accidents and starlets' tears into insurance claims. But tonight, the client wasn't a studio head. The client was a ghost. "The water is cold tonight, Nick," a voice murmured from the shadows beneath the wooden staircase. Nick didn't turn. He recognized the rasp. It was Lola Valentine, a woman who had spent the last decade playing the femme fatale in B-movies until the roles started to look too much like her real life. She stepped into the pink light, her platinum blonde hair looking like spun sugar, her silk wrap fluttering in the damp breeze. "Lola, you're supposed to be in Palm Springs, drying out," Nick said, lighting a Chesterfield. The wind caught the match, and for a second, his face was illuminated. Sharp features, eyes that had seen too many bodies in too many bathtubs. "I can't dry out when my sister's at the bottom of the bay, Nick," she whispered. She held out a small, damp object. It was a gold locket, encrusted with salt and tangled in a strand of thick, slimy bull kelp. Nick took it. The metal was cold. Inside was a micro-photograph of a man in a naval uniform. But the uniform wasn't American. It was a pattern Nick hadn't seen since the intelligence briefings in the Pacific Theater. "Mona disappeared from a party at the Glass House," Lola continued, her voice trembling. "You know the place, perched on the cliffs of Malibu, owned by that philanthropist from Geneva, Julian Vane." Nick knew the Glass House. It was an architectural marvel of steel and floor-to-ceiling windows, designed so the elite could watch the sunset while they discussed the price of souls. It was also the one place in LA where the police never knocked without an invitation. "Mona wasn't a jumper, Lola," Nick said, his eyes drifting back to the horizon. "She was a swimmer. She could do 2 miles in a choppy sea without breaking a sweat." "Then why did the Coast Guard find her shoes on the railing and nothing else?" Nick looked out past the pier. About 3 miles out, near the edge of the territorial waters, a single light flickered. Short, long, short. It wasn't a buoy. It was a signal. He looked at the kelp tangled in the locket. It was deep water kelp, the kind that only grows on the reefs far offshore. For it to be tangled in a locket on the shore meant it had been dragged in, or someone had brought it in from the depths. "Go home, Lola. Stay off the gin and lock your doors," Nick said, flicking his cigarette into the dark water. "I'm going to take a look at the Glass House. But if I find what I think I'm going to find, you're going to wish she had just jumped." Nick walked back toward his 1950 Cadillac Series 62, the tires crunching on the salt-stained asphalt. He drove north on the Pacific Coast Highway, the ocean to his left a vast, shimmering mirror reflecting a moon that looked like a cold silver coin. The PCH was empty, a ribbon of black asphalt winding between the hills and the abyss. As he approached Malibu, the Glass House appeared on the cliffside, glowing like a lantern. It was a monument to the new LA, transparent, expensive, and fragile. Nick pulled his car into a turnout a half-mile away. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a pair of Zeiss binoculars and a Colt .38. He didn't head for the front gate. He headed for the beach below the cliffs. The sound of the surf was a rhythmic, heavy thud here, the spray hitting his face with a bitter chill. He began to climb the rocks, his fingers searching for grips in the wet sandstone. This was the back door of the elite, the private cove where the tides were controlled by stone jetties. As he reached a ledge 20 feet above the water, he stopped. A small, black inflatable boat was pulling away from a hidden sea cave beneath the glass house. It moved silently, powered by an electric motor. On the back sat two men in dark tactical gear. Not mobsters, not thugs. They moved with the silent, lethal efficiency of frogmen. And in the middle of the boat sat a heavy, lead-sealed crate, marked with the seal of the Atomic Energy Commission. Nick raised his binoculars. He looked up at the glass house. Through the massive windows, he could see a party in full swing. Men in tuxedos, women in flowing gowns, the flash of diamonds. They were laughing, drinking, dancing on the edge of the world. They were the distraction. The real business of Los Angeles was happening beneath their feet, in the dark, cold embrace of the Pacific. And Mona Valentine hadn't jumped. She had seen the mirror from the other side, and the reflection had killed her. Nick felt a cold lump in his stomach. This wasn't a studio scandal. This was the birth of the Cold War's most private navy, and he was standing on a cliffside with nothing but a revolver and a dead girl's locket. They call it modernist architecture, but to a man like Nick St. Clair, the glass house looked like a beautiful aquarium where the sharks wore tuxedos. It was a masterpiece of cantilevered steel and reinforced plate glass, hanging over the Malibu cliffs like a frozen wave. Inside, the elite of Los Angeles, senators, studio heads, and the silent architects of the military-industrial complex, sipped dry martinis and pretended the world wasn't burning. But the transparency of the house was its biggest lie. Glass shows you everything, which is the perfect way to make sure you notice nothing. Nick stood on the service terrace, the salt spray from the rocks below settling on his dark wool suit like a fine shroud of diamonds. He had ditched the Cadillac and approached from the beach, scaling the cliffside like a thief in the night. The party was a roar of jazz and forced laughter, the sound muffled by the thick, soundproof panes. He slipped through a side door, a service entrance for the caterers. The kitchen smelled of poached salmon, expensive gin, and the sharp, chemical tang of silver polish. Nick moved with the fluid, silent grace of a predator who had spent too many years in the dark. He wasn't looking for the bar. He was looking for Julian Vane's private study. "More ice for the terrace, Jacques," a chef shouted, not even looking up from his station. Nick grabbed a silver tray, tilted his head down so his fedora shadowed his eyes, and walked straight into the lion's den. The main room of the glass house was a cathedral of light. The ceiling was 30 feet high, supported by slender chrome pillars that reflected the flickering candles. On a white grand piano, a woman in a dress made of sequins was singing something by Cole Porter, her voice lost in the sea of conversation. Nick scanned the crowd. He saw Julian Vane standing near the fireplace, a man with the tan of a playboy and the eyes of a taxidermist. He was talking to a man Nick recognized from the newspapers, General Curtis, the head of Pacific Logistics. "The delivery was on schedule, Julian," the general murmured, his voice cutting through the jazz like a cold blade. "The Deepwater Reef is the perfect dead drop. No radar, no Coast Guard, just the tide and the ghosts." "And the complication?" Vane asked, swirling the olive in his martini. Mona Valentine was a curious girl, Julian. Curiosity in 1952 is a terminal disease. The ocean took care of her. Nick felt a surge of cold fury in his chest, but he kept his face a mask of professional indifference. He drifted toward the back of the house, away from the glitter and the noise. He found the hallway to Vane's study, a long, narrow corridor lined with ancient maritime maps. At the end was a heavy door of solid teak. He slipped inside. The study didn't have glass walls. It was a bunker of wood and leather, smelling of old paper and expensive tobacco. Nick moved to the massive mahogany desk. He didn't look for money. He looked for the paper trail. In the bottom drawer, hidden behind a false back, he found it. A leather-bound logbook marked with the insignia of the Project Blue Mirror. Nick flipped through the pages. His heart hammered against his ribs. It wasn't just a smuggling operation. Vane was using the private cove beneath the glass house as a staging point for a fleet of unmarked midget submarines. The logbook contained coordinates for Deep Station Alpha, a location 5 miles off the coast, directly on the underwater shelf. The shipments weren't weapons. They were acoustic sensors and experimental sonar arrays. Vane wasn't just working for the government. He was building a private surveillance net under the Pacific, a mirror that could track every ship and submarine in the ocean without the Navy ever knowing it existed. "It's a beautiful view, isn't it, Mr. St. Clair?" The voice was soft, cultured, and came from the shadow in the corner of the room. Nick didn't reach for his gun. He knew he was outmatched. Julian Vane stepped into the light of the desk lamp, a small, silver-plated derringer held loosely in his hand. "I've heard of you, Nick. The studio fixer. The man who makes the messy things go away," Vane said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "But you're out of your depth here. You're trying to fix a leak in a dam that's already broken." Mona Valentine wasn't a leak, Vane. She was a human being. Nick spat, his grip tightening on the logbook. Mona was a beautiful distraction who saw a boat she shouldn't have seen. Now she's part of the reef. And you're just a man with a very expensive car and a very short future. Vane raised the derringer. "Give me the book, Nick, and maybe I'll let you choose which cliff you walk off." Suddenly the house shook. A low subterranean rumble vibrated through the floor, the sound of the sea cave below being flooded by the rising tide, or perhaps something much larger docking in the dark. The lights in the study flickered and died, plunging the room into a moonlight-soaked gray. "The tide is in, Julian," Nick whispered, his hand sliding toward the heavy brass desk lamp. "And I think your guests are early." The sound of an alarm began to wail, a sharp, piercing shriek that cut through the Cole Porter song in the main room. Panic erupted in the ballroom, the sound of breaking glass and screaming women. Nick didn't wait. He swung the desk lamp with all his might, catching Vane across the wrist. The derringer fired, the bullet shattering a vase on the mantelpiece, and Nick dove through the teak door, back into the hallway. He wasn't running for the exit. He was running for the stairs that led down to the sea cave. If he was going to expose the Project Blue Mirror, he needed more than a logbook. He needed to see the monster in the basement. As he descended into the cold, damp dark of the cliffside tunnels, the sound of the ocean grew into a roar. The smell of salt was overwhelming now, mixed with the electric ozone of heavy machinery. Nick St. Clair was going into the mouth of the shark, and this time there was no studio to bail him out. The transition from the penthouse to the basement of the glass house felt like falling out of a dream and into a slaughterhouse. 1 minute you're surrounded by the scent of expensive perfume and the clink of ice in crystal. The next, the air is a freezing slurry of salt, diesel, and the metallic tang of old blood. The stairs weren't made of polished chrome anymore. They were rusted iron, slick with the kind of black algae that only grows where the sun has been forgotten. Nick St. Clair descended into the throat of the cliff. The roar of the ocean was no longer a rhythmic lullaby. It was a rhythmic assault, each wave slamming against the stone foundations of the house with a force that made the very mountain tremble. He reached the bottom of the shaft and stepped onto a concrete catwalk. Below him lay the Blue Mirror docking bay, a natural sea cave that had been hollowed out with industrial explosives and reinforced with lead-lined steel. The water in the bay was a deep, unnatural turquoise, illuminated from below by powerful floodlights. And there it was, Image, a sleek, matte black midget submarine, looking like a predatory shark made of obsidian, floating silently in the illuminated water. It didn't have a flag. It didn't have a name. It only had a serial number etched into its conning tower in a typeface that didn't exist in any Navy manual. This was the Mirror, the ghost ship of the Pacific. "Check the seals on the acoustic array," a voice barked over the hiss of hydraulic pumps. Nick flattened himself against the damp stone wall. Across the bay, 3 men in black wetsuits were winching a heavy, cylindrical device into the sub's cargo bay. It was the sonar sensor from the logbook. If they deployed this, Julian Vane wouldn't just be a millionaire. He'd be the god of the coastline, listening to every heartbeat from Seattle to San Diego. But it wasn't the sub that caught Nick's eye. It was the object tied to a pylon near the edge of the water. It was a dive gear bag. A woman's bag. Nick crept closer, his boots squelching on the wet concrete. He reached the bag and pulled it open. Inside was a waterproof camera, its lens shattered, and a small, handheld notebook. He opened it to the last page. Mona Valentine's handwriting was shaky, written in the frantic scrawl of someone who knew the clock was running out. "They aren't just listening, Nick. They're broadcasting. The Blue Mirror isn't a sensor net. It's a beacon. They're guiding something in, something from the deep trench. Vane isn't working for Washington. He's selling the coast to..." The sentence ended in a jagged line of ink. Suddenly, the floodlights in the water flickered and turned blood red. The bay was plunged into a hellish, crimson glow. "The fixer's in the basement," a voice boomed, amplified by the cavern's acoustics. Nick looked up. The colonel, the same man from Julian Vane's office, was standing on the opposite catwalk, a harpoon gun in one hand and a suppressed grease gun in the other. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo anymore. He was in full combat gear, his face painted with black camouflage grease. "You should have stayed in the ballroom, St. Clair," the colonel shouted. "At least there, the death is slow and tastes like gin. Down here, it's just cold." The colonel opened fire. Thwip, thwip, thwip. The suppressed rounds chewed into the concrete pillars, sending shards of stone into Nick's face. He dove behind a stack of oxygen tanks, the metal ringing as the bullets ricocheted. Nick pulled his .38. He only had 4 rounds left. In a cave filled with armed commandos and a literal submarine, his odds were about as good as a snowball in the Mojave. "I know about the beacon, Colonel," Nick yelled, his voice echoing off the jagged ceiling. "I know you're bringing in more than just sensors. What's in the trench?" The colonel laughed, a sound like dry gravel being shaken in a tin can. "The future, Nick. A future where the borders aren't drawn on maps, but on the ocean floor. And you're just a footnote in a history book that will never be printed." The colonel gestured to the frogmen in the water. They drew long, serrated diving knives and began to climb onto the catwalk from both sides, their black suits glistening in the red light like the skin of seals. Nick was trapped between the rock and the rising tide. The water was already swirling around his ankles, pulled in by the surging swell of the Pacific. He looked at the oxygen tanks he was hiding behind. Then he looked at the sub's fuel line, a thick rubber hose snaking across the floor. "You want to fix something, Nick?" the colonel sneered, stepping closer. "Fix the fact that you're about to become part of the reef." Nick didn't answer. He aimed his .38 not at the colonel, but at the brass regulator of the oxygen tank. "Mona told me one thing," Nick whispered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "She said the view from the other side of the mirror is much clearer." Bang! The tank didn't just leak, it screamed. The pressurized gas ignited a nearby spark from the hydraulic pump, and for a split second, the cave became the inside of a sun. Nick didn't wait for the explosion. He grabbed Mona's bag and threw himself into the churning, freezing water of the bay, diving deep into the turquoise abyss, away from the red light and the fire. As he swam through the underwater tunnel that led out to the open ocean, he heard a sound that made his blood run colder than the water. It was a low-frequency hum, a song from the deep. Something was answering the beacon. They say the ocean has a memory, but they're wrong. The ocean has a stomach. It doesn't remember. It just digests. As Nick St. Clair clawed his way through the jagged underwater tunnel, his lungs screaming for air that wasn't filled with salt and diesel, he realized that the Pacific mirror wasn't meant to reflect our world. It was a window, and something on the other side had just noticed the light. Nick broke the surface 500 yards offshore. The storm had arrived with a vengeance. The Pacific, once a shimmering mirror, was now a churning cauldron of black ink and white foam. Rain lashed down like iron nails, and the wind howled through the cliffs of Malibu like a choir of the damned. In the distance, perched on the cliff like a dying star, the glass house was burning. The explosion in the sea cave had sent a pillar of orange flame through the center of the villa, shattering the floor-to-ceiling windows. The elite of LA were screaming on the lawn, their tuxedos and gowns ruined, watching their temple of transparency melt into the sea. But Nick's attention wasn't on the fire. It was on the water. A mile offshore, directly over the coordinates for Deep Station Alpha, the sea began to behave unnaturally. The waves didn't just break. They parted, forming a perfect, glassy circle in the middle of the churning chaos. In the center of that circle, the water began to glow with a sickly, bioluminescent blue, the kind of light produced by creatures that have never seen the sun. "The beacon!" Nick gasped, clinging to a piece of driftwood. They actually did it. Julian Vane's yacht, the Silver Siren, was cutting through the swells at full throttle, heading straight for the epicenter of the glow. Vane wasn't running away. He was heading for a rendezvous with his investor. Nick knew he had no chance of swimming to the yacht, but he had another plan. He reached into Mona's bag and pulled out not just the camera, but the flare gun she had swiped from the inflatable boat. "If I can't stop the guest, I'll change the invitation," Nick muttered. He fired. The brilliant red flare tore through the black sky, illuminating for a split second what was rising from the depths. It wasn't a submarine, and it wasn't a whale. Rising from the water was a structure, a massive, domed craft covered in a scale-like alloy of an unknown metal, studded with thousands of lenses. Each lens looked toward Los Angeles with a cold, calculating curiosity. This was deep state surveillance on a planetary scale. This was the Janus Group, for an audience that wasn't human. Vane's yacht pulled alongside the structure. Through his binoculars, Nick saw Julian standing on the bow, arms outstretched as if welcoming a god. But the guest didn't need a welcome. A low-frequency pulse erupted from the dome. The sonic wave was so powerful that the water around the yacht instantly vaporized. The Silver Siren simply ceased to exist. It didn't explode. It disintegrated, leaving nothing but a cloud of white dust that was immediately swallowed by the storm. Julian Vane finally got his transparency. He became part of the atmosphere. Nick felt the shock wave hit him, lifting him from the water and hurling him toward the jagged shoreline. The world went black. The next morning, the Pacific was as calm as a mirror in a dead man's bedroom. The Coast Guard reported a rare seismic shift that caused a localized tsunami and a fire in a private Malibu residence. The disappearance of actress Mona Valentine was ruled an accidental drowning during the storm. There was no mention of Vane's yacht. Officially, it had never existed. Nick was found on the sands of Santa Monica 2 days later. He had 3 broken ribs and a retina burned by the blue light. But in his fist, he was still clutching Mona's camera. When he woke up in an underground clinic run by a former Navy surgeon, the first thing he did was develop the film. There was only one clear frame. Image, a grainy black and white photo. Underwater, at an immense depth, a colossal eye is visible. In its pupil, the entire skyline of Los Angeles, the skyscrapers, the palms, the people, is reflected. And beneath the pupil, an inscription in Latin etched directly into the metal of the object. Speculum Mundi, the mirror of the world. Nick understood it all then. The deep state wasn't just spying on us. They had made a deal. They had given up the ocean to them so they could watch us from below, while the government watched us from above. We were trapped between 2 mirrors, and in that reflection, there was no room for the truth. Mona Valentine had seen that mirror. She saw that we were just feed for what lives in the abyss. And Nick St. Clair knew it too. He threw the camera into the furnace. Because some things aren't meant to be captured on film. They are only meant to be felt when you stand on the shore and realize that the Pacific Ocean isn't water. It's a massive, unblinking eye.